They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood was simply a currency, traded and leveraged to maintain an illusion of flawless generational wealth. For as long as I could remember, I was the quiet one, the responsible older sister who faded into the expensive wallpaper of our Connecticut estate, while the rest of my family basked in the spotlight. I accepted my role because I believed that family, no matter how deeply flawed or fiercely demanding, was supposed to protect you. I had absolutely no idea that while I was busy trying to earn their respect, they were actively building a cage to lock me away in a federal prison. My name is Corinne Wallace, and I am 42 years old. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The velvet curtain of my family's deception began to unravel on a crisp, unseasonably cold evening in late October. My parents, Benedict and Julianne, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. The Wallace Estate, a sprawling, ivy-covered stone mansion nestled in the affluent hills of Connecticut, was ablaze with light and dripping in ostentatious luxury. My father, Benedict, at 70 years old, was the imposing patriarch of a prominent real estate and trust empire. He was a man who commanded a room not by speaking loudly, but by expecting absolute, unquestioning obedience. Beside him stood my mother, Julianne, 68, her face a carefully preserved mask of high society perfection. She was the gatekeeper of the Wallace name, a woman who measured human worth strictly by bank accounts, zip codes, and country club memberships. My husband David and I arrived exactly on time, slipping through the heavy oak doors and into the grand foyer. David is a structural engineer, a brilliant, kind, and fiercely grounding man who has always been my safe harbor in the chaotic storm of my family. He squeezed my hand as we handed our coats to the hired staff, sensing the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. We were family, but we were treated like reluctant obligations. As we stepped into the grand ballroom, the disparity was immediately suffocating. We were directed by a severe-looking event coordinator to a small, dimly lit table near the kitchen swinging doors, the absolute furthest point from the grand head table. Meanwhile, bathed in the glow of the massive crystal chandeliers at the very center of the room, stood my younger sister, Savannah. Savannah was 35, the undisputed golden child of the Wallace dynasty. She was draped in a custom-fitted silk gown that probably cost more than my first car, laughing musically as she held court among the local politicians and wealthy developers. She lived a life of frivolous luxury, curating a flawless aesthetic for her thousands of followers online, never once worrying about the consequences of her spending. Standing proudly beside her with a smug, self-satisfied grin was her husband, Wyatt Brooks. Wyatt was the chief financial officer of the Wallace family empire. He was a man whose arrogance entered a room 5 minutes before he did, a slick, fast-talking executive who had completely charmed my father and secured his place as the heir apparent to the family business. I watched them from our shadowed corner, sipping a glass of cheap, sparkling water while waiters passed us by with trays of expensive champagne, heading straight for the VIPs. "You look beautiful tonight," David murmured, leaning over to kiss my temple. "Don't let them get to you. We'll make an appearance, eat the free food, and go back to our quiet, peaceful life." I offered him a grateful smile, but before I could reply, a sharp, manicured finger tapped my shoulder. I turned to find my mother, Julianne, looking down at me. She smelled of expensive Chanel perfume and cold judgment. "Corinne, darling," she said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of maternal condescension she had perfected over decades. "I see you found your seats. I thought it would be best to put you back here. You and David always prefer to avoid the networking anyway. It's so much quieter." "It's fine, Mother. Congratulations on 40 years, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Julianne sighed, her eyes dragging over my modest, off-the-rack navy dress. "Yes, well, it's a milestone. Oh, before I forget, could you be a dear and run to the catering tent out back? Tell them we need more of the caviar blinis at the VIP tables. The staff seems overwhelmed." She was asking her eldest daughter to act as an errand runner at her anniversary gala. David's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to defend me, but I placed a gentle hand on his knee under the table. Fighting with Julianne was a game you could never win. She would only twist it to make herself the victim. "Of course," I said quietly. As I stood up, Wyatt sauntered over, wrapping a heavy arm around my mother's shoulders. He looked me up and down with a thinly veiled smirk. "Corinne, didn't see you hiding back here. How's the thrilling world of corporate paperwork? Still pushing papers at that insurance firm?" I'm a compliance auditor, Wyatt, I corrected softly. My mother let out a small theatrical laugh. Oh, let her be, Wyatt. Someone has to do the boring math in the world. We can't all be visionaries like you and your father. She patted his cheek affectionately, a gesture she hadn't given me since I was a child. Run along now, Corinne. The caviar. I walked away, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation. They truly believed I was nothing but a dull, uninspired paper pusher. They thought my job consisted of sitting in a gray cubicle, mindlessly stamping forms and adding up receipts. They had absolutely no concept of what a senior compliance auditor actually did. I didn't just do math. I hunted anomalies. I spent my days dissecting massive, multi-tiered corporate structures, uncovering hidden financial liabilities, and dismantling the exact kind of white-collar fraud that men in expensive suits thought they were smart enough to hide. I was trained to see the invisible threads of deception that tied shell companies and offshore accounts together. I was a predator in the financial ecosystem, but to my family, I was just the disappointing daughter who didn't care about designer labels. The gala ended, and David and I returned to our peaceful, unassuming life. For a few weeks, the sting of the anniversary party faded into the background noise of my demanding career. I was buried in a massive audit for a healthcare conglomerate, working late nights from my home office, happy to put the Wallace family drama out of my mind. But the universe has a funny way of ripping the blinders off your eyes when you least expect it. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late November. I had just come home from the office, shaking off my wet umbrella, when I noticed a thick, official-looking envelope sitting on our kitchen island. It had yellow forwarding stickers plastered across the front. It had originally been mailed to an old apartment David and I had rented nearly a decade ago, right after we were married, and had slowly made its way through the postal system to our current home. I set my briefcase down and picked it up. The return address made my blood run instantly cold. It was from the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Tax Lien Division. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable stutter. David and I were meticulous with our finances. We lived well below our means, carried zero debt, and filed our taxes with agonizing precision. There was absolutely no reason the IRS should be sending us a heavy, registered notice. I tore the thick paper open with my thumb, my eyes scanning the bold, black text on the first page. The breath completely vanished from my lungs. It was a final notice of intent to levy. The IRS was threatening immediate seizure of assets for unpaid corporate taxes, penalties, and severe interest. The total amount due was a staggering $4.2 million. But that wasn't the part that made the room spin. I stared at the entity name listed on the debt. It didn't say my name or David's name. It read, CW Holdings LLC. And directly beneath the corporate name, listed as the sole proprietor and chief executive officer, was my full legal name, tied to my exact social security number. I sank into the kitchen stool, the heavy paper trembling in my hands. CW Holdings. I had never heard of this company in my entire life. I had never registered a limited liability corporation, let alone one that had managed to accrue millions of dollars in federal tax debt. The letter detailed the nature of the business: commercial real estate acquisitions and high-risk construction loans. Panic, hot and suffocating, clawed at my throat. My first instinct, the natural human reaction, was to pick up the phone, call the police, and report a massive case of identity theft. I reached for my cell phone, my fingers hovering over the keypad to dial David. But then, the training kicked in. The years of analyzing fraud, of understanding how financial predators operate, slammed down like a heavy steel door, shutting out the panic and replacing it with a cold, terrifying clarity. Identity thieves do not typically open massive commercial real estate holding companies. They steal credit cards, they buy electronics, they drain personal checking accounts. They do not orchestrate multi-million-dollar corporate tax frauds using the real, traceable social security number of an auditor. This wasn't a random hacker in a basement. This was a highly sophisticated, meticulously planned corporate structure. Someone had built a massive financial entity using my identity as the foundational brick, and they had used my old apartment address, an address I hadn't lived at in 10 years. An address that only my family would have on file in their old personal records. I didn't call the police. I didn't call David. I took a deep breath, walked into my home office, and locked the door. I booted up my encrypted work laptop. If someone was using my name to play a multi-million-dollar game of financial roulette, I was going to find out exactly who they were before I made a single move. I bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus. As a compliance expert, I had legal access to deep-level public records, corporate registration databases, and federal filing systems. I typed the employer identification number, EIN, listed on the IRS letter into a secure federal registry. The search engine hummed for 3 agonizing seconds before spitting out a dense 50-page digital dossier on CW Holdings, LLC. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, the rain lashing heavily against my office window. The company had been incorporated 3 years ago in Delaware, a classic move for hiding corporate ownership. I scrolled past the initial filings, digging into the capitalization records and the loan origination documents. CW Holdings wasn't just a shell company. It was a black hole. Over the past 36 months, this fake entity had systematically taken out massive, high-interest commercial loans from several private equity firms. The stated purpose of these loans was always the same: to purchase, renovate, and flip high-end commercial properties in the Northeast. I opened the attached property deeds and cross-referenced the addresses. Every single property that CW Holdings supposedly purchased was a building already owned, developed, or managed by the Wallace Family Trust. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. My hands flew across the keyboard, executing a deep dive trace on the money flow. The loans were being approved based on my artificially inflated credit profile and forged financial statements. The millions of dollars would hit the CW Holdings bank account, sit there for exactly 48 hours, and then be wired out as consulting fees and management retainers. I tracked the wire routing numbers. The money wasn't disappearing into the ether. It was being funneled directly back into the primary operating accounts of the Wallace family empire. Someone inside my own family was using my stolen identity to take out millions of dollars in fraudulent loans, funneling the cash into the family business to keep it afloat, and leaving my name holding the bag for the debt, the taxes, and the inevitable federal fraud charges. I felt physically sick. The betrayal hit me with the force of a freight train. My family had always been cold and they had always been demanding, but this was a staggering level of criminal malice. I needed to know exactly whose hand was on the knife. I dug deeper into the original incorporation documents from Delaware. Delaware is notoriously secretive, shielding the names of true owners, but whoever set this up had made a tiny, arrogant mistake. They had used a registered agent service, but they had paid the initial $500 filing fee using a corporate credit card. I ran a reverse search on the payment ledger. The screen blinked, loading the transaction receipt. The name on the credit card used to purchase the LLC that was currently framing me for federal tax evasion glowed in harsh white letters against the dark screen. Wyatt Brooks, my brother-in-law, the smug, arrogant chief financial officer who had mocked my boring career at the anniversary gala. The man who wore tailored suits and smoked expensive cigars while secretly bleeding the family empire dry and using me as his human shield. I sat back in my desk chair, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Wyatt thought he was an untouchable genius. He thought he could exploit the quiet, unassuming sister-in-law because she wouldn't have the financial literacy to understand the matrix he had built. He thought I would just panic, get arrested, and take the fall while he and Savannah continued to live in their pristine mansion. He had completely underestimated me. He didn't know that he had just handed the blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise to a woman who made a living burning fraudulent empires to the ground. I stared at his name on the screen, feeling the last remnants of my familial loyalty evaporate into the cold, rainy night. Wyatt had drawn first blood, but he was about to learn a very painful lesson. You do not play a game of financial destruction with a senior compliance auditor. The fear was entirely gone now, replaced by a dark, diamond-sharp rage. I reached for my notebook, clicked my pen, and began to outline the absolute demolition of Wyatt Brooks. The morning after I discovered the IRS letter, I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee that had gone completely cold. I hadn't slept a single minute. The 50-page dossier on CW Holdings lay spread out before me, a terrifying mosaic of forged signatures, fake loan originations, and a multi-million-dollar tax bomb ticking down to zero. When David walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he took one look at my face and stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply pulled out the stool next to me, sat down, and looked at the documents. I explained it to him systematically, removing all emotion from my voice. I walked him through the shell company, the forged entity registrations, the commercial real estate loans, and the undeniable proof that my brother-in-law, Wyatt, had used his corporate credit card to pay the initial Delaware filing fees. David's reaction was exactly what you would expect from a fiercely protective husband. His face flushed a dark, angry red, and he stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "I am calling the FBI right now," David said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "We are getting a lawyer, we are going to the police, and I am personally going to drive to that estate and break Wyatt's jaw." "No," I said, my voice sharp enough to stop him halfway to the phone. "David, look at me. You cannot touch him. We cannot call a lawyer yet." He turned to me, absolute disbelief in his eyes. "Corinne, they are framing you for federal tax evasion. The IRS is threatening to seize our assets. We have to defend ourselves." "If we move now, we lose," I explained, forcing him to look at the cold, hard math of the situation. Wyatt is the chief financial officer of a massive real estate empire. He has a team of corporate defense attorneys on retainer. If I walk into a police station today with a credit card receipt and an IRS letter, Wyatt will simply claim his corporate card was compromised by a third-party hacker. He will say he is a victim of identity theft, just like me. He will wipe his servers, shred the internal ledgers, and burn the evidence before the ink on the police report is even dry. The federal government moves slowly, David. Wyatt moves fast. David placed his hands flat on the kitchen island, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "So, what do? We just wait for the IRS to freeze our bank accounts?" "No," I said, stacking the CW Holdings documents into a neat, precise pile. "We buy time. I am going to file a standard administrative dispute with the IRS to stall the asset seizure. It will give us a 90-day window. During that time, I am going not just to prove that Wyatt opened this account. I am going to map every single dollar he stole, trace it to its exact hiding place, and build a prosecution package so airtight that no lawyer on earth can save him." David looked at me, seeing the absolute icy resolve in my eyes. He nodded slowly. "Tell me what you need me to do." "I need you to act perfectly normal," I said, "because this Sunday we are going to my parents' house for dinner, and I am going to play the role of the boring, clueless daughter they think I am." And the following Sunday, the Wallace estate looked exactly as it always did, imposing, pristine, and suffocating. The autumn leaves had been perfectly swept from the sweeping driveway, and the smell of roasting lamb drifted from the massive gourmet kitchen. I wore a plain beige sweater and a pair of slacks, intentionally dressing down to feed into their narrative of my uninspired life. In my oversized tote bag rested my encrypted work laptop. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological endurance. We sat in the formal dining room beneath a glittering chandelier. My mother, Julianne, spent the first 20 minutes directing the kitchen staff and the next 20 minutes fawning over Savannah. Savannah was pregnant with her first child, a fact that had elevated her from the family's golden child to an absolute deity in my mother's eyes. "Wyatt is looking at a summer home in the Hamptons for us," Savannah announced, taking a delicate sip of sparkling cider. "We want the baby to have plenty of fresh air away from the city." "Oh, that's wonderful, darling," Julianne cooed, reaching across the table to squeeze Wyatt's hand. "You provide so beautifully for her, Wyatt. Benedict, isn't that wonderful?" My father, sitting at the head of the table carving the roast, offered a rare, approving smile. "Real estate is the only true wealth, Wyatt. You're making smart moves." I chewed my food methodically, tasting absolutely nothing. The money Wyatt was using to casually browse summer homes in the Hamptons was stolen. It was funneled through the shell company bearing my name, leaving a trail of unpaid federal taxes that would eventually destroy my life. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the man sitting across from me was almost impossible to comprehend. He was eating the meal my mother prepared, smiling at my father, all while actively orchestrating my ruin. As the dessert plates were cleared, I made my move. I let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh and rubbed my temples, mimicking the posture of a deeply stressed, overwhelmed clerical worker. "Is everything all right, Corinne?" David asked, playing his part flawlessly. "It's just work," I mumbled, looking down at my coffee cup. "The firm updated our compliance software this weekend, and it's completely locked me out of the federal tax portal. I have a massive audit due tomorrow, and my laptop won't authenticate the server certificates. I've been on hold with IT all afternoon, but they're useless." Wyatt leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. He couldn't resist. His ego was too massive to let an opportunity to showcase his superiority pass him by. "You're probably dealing with a localized DNS-er," Wyatt said, his tone dripping with condescending tech bro authority. "Or your firm's firewall is blocking the new IP gateway." Corporate IT departments are notoriously incompetent. "I wouldn't even know where to begin checking that," I said, injecting a pathetic note of helplessness into my voice. I looked up at him, widening my eyes. "Wyatt, you're an expert with these enterprise systems. Would you mind taking a quick look? I have my laptop in my bag. I'm desperate." My mother rolled her eyes, sighing loudly. "Corinne, really? Wyatt works 80-hour weeks managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio, and you want him to fix your little computer glitches during Sunday dinner?" "It's fine, Julianne," Wyatt said, holding up a magnanimous hand. He loved this. He loved playing the brilliant savior to the dim-witted sister-in-law. "Bring it to my study, Corinne. I'll get you back online in 5 minutes." I followed Wyatt down the long, carpeted hallway to his private study. It was a room that screamed old money and new arrogance. Dark mahogany bookshelves, leather armchairs, and a massive state-of-the-art dual-monitor workstation. I placed my laptop on his desk and powered it on. The screen booted up to a fake error page I had coded myself that morning, a highly convincing loop of server timeout messages. "Let me see," Wyatt said, sliding into his leather chair. He cracked his knuckles and began typing. "I think it needs an unrestricted network to bypass the corporate VPN proxy," I suggested innocently, hovering over his shoulder. "Obviously," Wyatt scoffed. "I'll just put you on my private home office network. It bypasses all the commercial throttles." He clicked on the Wi-Fi icon on my screen, selected the hidden network labeled Wallace Secure, and typed in the complex 30-character alphanumeric password. That was it. That was the moment he signed his own death warrant. Wyatt didn't know that my laptop was not a standard corporate machine. It was a highly customized compliance auditor's rig. The moment he authenticated my machine onto his private, encrypted network, a silent background script I had preloaded sprang into action. Without flashing a single warning on the screen, my laptop deployed a packet sniffer, a sophisticated network diagnostic tool, directly into his router's firmware. A packet sniffer is invisible. It doesn't steal files or lock computers. It simply sits on the network like a digital wiretap, copying every single piece of unencrypted data, every DNS request, and every email server handshake that passed through the Wallace Estates Wi-Fi and mirroring it directly to my secure cloud server. "There," Wyatt said, hitting the enter key a few times. He had completely ignored the fake error code and simply reset my local network adapter, which, conveniently, made the fake error page disappear. "You're connected? The gateway is clear." "Wow," I said, forcing a look of absolute awe onto my face. "You fixed it. Thank you so much, Wyatt. I really don't understand how you keep all this straight in your head." He smirked, handing the laptop back to me. "It's just basic logic, Corinne. Don't worry about it. Stick to the paperwork." I closed my laptop, the digital wiretap now firmly embedded in the heart of his financial fortress. "I will," I said softly. For the next 2 months, I barely slept. I maintained my daily routine, going to the office, auditing healthcare conglomerates, and coming home to David. But my real work began at midnight. Every night, I logged into my secure cloud server and downloaded the daily data haul from Wyatt's network. It was like drinking from a fire hose of corporate corruption. Wyatt was careless. He believed that because his home network was physically located within the guarded gates of the Wallace estate, it was impenetrable. He didn't use end-to-end encryption for his internal communications with my father. He used a legacy, privately hosted email server that they thought kept them off the grid of commercial tech giants like Google or Microsoft. To an auditor with a packet sniffer, an unencrypted legacy server is a goldmine. I spent weeks piecing the puzzle together, analyzing the intercepted emails and bank routing requests. What I found was far worse than a simple case of embezzlement. Wyatt wasn't just stealing from the family empire. He was frantically trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. My father, the great Benedict Wallace, was a severe gambling addict. But he didn't gamble at casinos. He gambled on high-risk, unzoned commercial real estate developments. Over the past 5 years, my father had taken massive, catastrophic bets on retail shopping centers right before the market completely cratered. The Wallace Family Trust, which presented an image of boundless wealth to the country club, was actually bleeding millions of dollars a month in toxic debt. They were effectively bankrupt. Wyatt had created CW Holdings using my identity not just to steal, but to artificially generate liquid cash. He was taking out fraudulent loans under my name, funneling the cash into the Wallace Trust to pay off my father's toxic debts, and planning to let the shell company and me take the massive federal tax hit when the house of cards finally collapsed. It was a staggering, desperate scheme. But as I read through the ledgers, a cold, nagging question began to form in the back of my mind. Why me? Why didn't Wyatt use a random stolen identity bought on the dark web? Why risk using the social security number of his own sister-in-law, an auditor who might eventually notice the discrepancies? The answer arrived on a Thursday night in late December. I was sitting in the dim light of my home office, scrolling through a newly intercepted batch of emails between Wyatt and my father. The subject line of the email thread was marked Urgent, Q4 Liability Shield. I clicked on the first message sent by Wyatt at 11:30 p.m. the night before. Benedict, Wyatt wrote, the private equity guys are asking for audited financials on the last 3 property flips. CW Holdings is drawing too much heat. The IRS tax lien has been issued. We need to initiate the firewall protocol before the end of the year, or they are going to trace the management fees back to the primary Wallace accounts. My eyes scanned down to my father's reply, timestamped just 20 minutes later. I read the words, and the air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Keep the firewall up, my father wrote. If the IRS pushes for a formal audit, point them directly to Corinne. Ensure the digital footprint leads exclusively to her old address and her personal accounts. Savannah cannot handle the stress of a federal investigation, not with the baby coming. Corinne is tough. She has no dependents, no public profile, and her modest lifestyle makes her look like she could be hiding money. She will survive a few years in a minimum security facility. It is the necessary cost of protecting the family name. We agreed on this. We agreed on this. I read the sentence again, my vision blurring. The cursor blinked steadily at the end of the paragraph, a rhythmic, mocking heartbeat. I scrolled further down the thread, my hands shaking violently. There was a forwarded message attached from earlier in the month. It was from my mother's private iPad. Wyatt, make sure Corinne's name is the only one on those Delaware documents Julianne had written. Benedict is right. We cannot risk the Wallace Trust. Corinne has always been the strong, silent one. She doesn't need our social standing. Savannah does. Do whatever is necessary to shield the estate. A profound, agonizing silence descended upon my office. I sat completely frozen, staring at the glowing white screen. For 30 days, I had operated under the assumption that Wyatt was a rogue actor. I believed that my brother-in-law was a greedy, arrogant criminal who was secretly exploiting my family and using me as collateral damage. I thought I was protecting my parents by not going to the police immediately. I thought I was going to save the family empire from Wyatt's corruption. I was wrong. Wyatt wasn't deceiving my parents. He was operating under their direct, explicit orders. My father, the man who had walked me down the aisle, had calmly typed out a directive to frame me for federal crimes. My mother, the woman who had brushed my hair when I was a little girl, had coldly calculated that my life was entirely expendable because I didn't care about their country club status. They didn't just passively allow this to happen. They had sat in their luxurious study, looked at their 2 daughters, and consciously decided to throw one to the wolves so the other could keep buying designer clothes. They viewed my lack of children and my quiet, unflashy lifestyle not as personal choices, but as proof that my existence possessed absolutely zero value. I didn't cry. The betrayal was so massive, so absolute, that it bypassed sorrow entirely and struck a deep, primal nerve of survival. For 42 years, I had accepted their condescension. I had swallowed their insults, endured their blatant favoritism toward Savannah, and convinced myself that blood demanded loyalty. I had twisted myself into knots trying to be the reliable, invisible daughter, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride they showered on my sister. Reading those emails was the ultimate liberation. It severed the invisible chains of guilt and familial obligation that had bound me to them since childhood. The people living in that Connecticut mansion were not my family. They were parasites. They were financial predators who had made the fatal mistake of targeting an apex predator. I reached out and gently closed the lid of my laptop. The room plunged into darkness. The pain in my chest hardened, calcifying into a pure, cold, and diamond-sharp rage. My parents thought I was a weak, boring paper pusher who would quietly take the fall to save their precious family name. They thought my silence was submission. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed the architect of their destruction the final blueprint. I didn't just want to clear my name anymore. Clearing my name would only put Wyatt in prison. It wouldn't touch Benedict. It wouldn't touch Julianne. It wouldn't strip away the arrogant, unearned luxury that Savannah paraded around in. I was going to let them think their plan was working flawlessly. I was going to smile at them across the dinner table, eat their food, and play the obedient daughter, all while silently wrapping a financial noose around the neck of the entire Wallace empire. The undercover investigation was officially over. It was time to start weaving the web. The deep, freezing winter of late January settled over Connecticut, blanketing the Wallace estate in pristine, blinding white snow. Inside my own home, the atmosphere was a stark contrast. My home office had transformed into a war room. The 90-day administrative hold I had filed with the IRS was actively ticking down, buying me the crucial time I needed. David and I operated in a state of quiet, hyper-focused synchronization. He managed the household, keeping our daily routines flawlessly normal, while I spent every spare second meticulously charting the fraudulent financial architecture Wyatt had built. I was waiting for my family to make their next move. I knew it was coming. The intercepted emails between Wyatt and my father had clearly outlined their panic. The private equity firms were demanding audited financials for the end of the first quarter, and CW Holdings was buckled under the pressure of the IRS tax lien. They needed to solidify the legal firewall protecting the Wallace Trust, and to do that, they needed my physical signature on a fresh stack of forged documents. The trap was finally sprung on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. My cell phone buzzed on my desk at work. It was my mother. "Corinne, darling," Julianne's voice floated through the speaker, unnervingly bright and laced with a manufactured warmth that instantly made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Your father and I were hoping you could come by the estate this Thursday for a late lunch, just the three of us. No David, no Savannah. We feel like we haven't had a proper, quiet catch-up with our eldest daughter in ages." And I stared at the blinking cursor on my dual monitors, feeling a cold, clinical detachment wash over me. For 42 years, an invitation like this would have sent me into a desperate flurry of anxiety and hope. I would have agonized over what to wear, hoping that this time, finally, they would look at me with genuine affection. Now, I just heard the rattle of a rattlesnake. "Of course, Mother," I replied, pitching my voice to sound pleasantly surprised. "Thursday works perfectly. I can take a half day from the firm." "Wonderful," she cooed. "We'll see you at 2. When I told David about the lunch that evening, his jaw locked. "You're not going alone," he stated, crossing his arms. "If they try to corner you, I want to be there." "If you go, they won't present the documents," I explained gently, packing my leather work tote. "They need me isolated. They think I'm intimidated by them, and they rely on that dynamic to force my compliance. David, I need them to hand me those papers. It's the physical proof that ties Benedict directly to the fraud. Up until now, everything has been digital. I need the paper trail." I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a small, matte black square, no larger than a postage stamp. It was a high-frequency, voice-activated audio transmitter, a piece of commercial espionage equipment I had purchased entirely in cash from a specialized security vendor 2 towns over. "I won't be entirely alone," I told him, slipping the tiny device into the lining of my purse. Thursday arrived with a bitter, biting wind. I drove my modest sedan up the winding, perfectly plowed driveway of the Wallace estate. The massive stone mansion loomed against the gray sky, a monument to a bankrupt legacy. A uniformed housekeeper let me in and directed me to the sunroom at the back of the house. The room was enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the frozen, manicured gardens. A fire crackled warmly in the massive stone hearth. Sitting at a round, wrought iron table set with delicate bone china were my parents. Benedict stood up as I entered, a rare, calculated gesture of respect. "Corinne, come, sit down. You look tired. Are they working you too hard at that insurance firm?" "It's audit season, Father. It's always busy," I said, taking the seat across from them. I set my purse down on the floor, perfectly positioned right next to the leg of the table. Julianne poured me a cup of Earl Grey tea, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, assessing eyes. "Well, you must remember to take care of yourself. We worry about you living so quietly. Savannah is always surrounded by people, but you're so independent." The meal was a surreal, sickening pantomime of parental affection. They asked about my garden, my husband, and my commute. They nodded thoughtfully, playing the roles of loving, interested parents with terrifying precision. I ate small bites of my salad, matching their fake smiles with my own, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, churning anticipation. As the housekeeper cleared the plates, the atmosphere in the sunroom shifted. The casual warmth evaporated, replaced by the heavy, authoritative gravity my father used to command boardrooms. Benedict reached into a leather briefcase resting beside his chair and pulled out a thick, legal-size manila folder. He placed it squarely on the glass table between us. Corinne, as you know, the Wallace Family Trust has been navigating some complex tax restructuring this quarter, Benedict began, folding his hands together. His voice was smooth, practiced. Your brother-in-law, Wyatt, has been working tirelessly to update our liability shields. As part of the new federal tax code, we are required to update the signature authorizations for all family members associated with the legacy accounts. He slid the folder toward me and flipped it open. Inside was a stack of dense, single-spaced legal contracts. I didn't need to read the fine print to know what they were. They were retroactive indemnification clauses and ownership transfers. They were legally binding documents designed to officially tie my name to the toxic debt of CW Holdings, completely shielding the Wallace Trust from the upcoming IRS implosion. It's just standard bureaucratic housekeeping, Julianne chimed in, leaning forward to touch my hand lightly. We know you hate dealing with the family finances, darling, so Wyatt pre-filled everything for you. All you need to do is sign at the sticky tabs. We have his private notary waiting at the office to stamp them later this afternoon. It will save you a trip downtown. Using a private, absent notary. It was illegal, highly unethical, and the absolute hallmark of corporate fraud. They were trying to rush me, banking on my lifelong habit of obediently following their instructions just to avoid a confrontation. I looked down at the documents, then up at my parents. I let a flicker of manufactured hesitation cross my face. This is a lot of paperwork, Father, I murmured, picking up the heavy gold fountain pen he had placed next to the folder. Are you sure this won't affect my personal tax filings? David and I are very careful. My father's jaw tightened infinitesimally. He hated being questioned. Corinne, I have managed this family's wealth for 40 years. Do you honestly think I would ask my own daughter to sign something that would harm her? The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the statement almost made me laugh out loud. I looked into his eyes, searching for a single ounce of guilt, a flicker of hesitation. There was nothing, just the cold, demanding stare of a patriarch who expected his orders to be followed. Of course not, I said softly. I touched my stomach, letting my posture slump slightly. I'm sorry, the tea isn't sitting quite right. Could you excuse me for just a moment? I need to use the powder room before I look these over. Julianne's smile tightened into a brittle line of annoyance. Hurry back, Corinne. Your father has a golf tee time at 4. I'll be quick, I promised. As I stood up, I clumsily knocked my purse over. It spilled onto the floor beneath the table. I ducked down, apologizing profusely, and as I scooped my wallet and keys back into the bag, I quickly peeled the adhesive backing off the tiny black audio transmitter and pressed it firmly to the underside of the heavy wrought iron table. I stood back up, slung my purse over my shoulder, and walked out of the sunroom, leaving the folder of fraudulent documents behind. I walked down the long, silent hallway to the guest powder room. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me and turned on the brass faucet, letting the water run to mask any sound. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, opened the encrypted application tied to the transmitter, and put in my wireless earbud. The audio feed was crystal clear. The crackle of the fireplace, the clinking of china cups, and then the sharp, impatient voice of my mother. She's hesitating, Julianne hissed, her fake warmth entirely gone. I told you we shouldn't have been so nice to her, Benedict. It makes her suspicious. She's used to us ignoring her. Relax, Julianne, my father replied, his tone dismissive and irritated. She's a timid clerk. She just wants to feel like she's a part of the family business for 5 minutes. She'll sign them. She always does exactly what she is told. I stood perfectly still in front of the ornate bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection. The water cascaded into the porcelain sink, a steady white noise beneath the terrifying reality playing in my ear. I just want this over with, my mother said, her voice dropping to a harsh, pragmatic whisper. Wyatt said the IRS is already sending final notices to her old address. If she doesn't sign these retroactive liability waivers today, the federal auditors are going to look right past CW Holdings and come straight for the Wallace Trust. That is not going to happen, Benedict stated with absolute terrifying certainty. The firewall is solid. Wyatt built it perfectly. Corinne's signature on these documents will legally sever CW Holdings from our primary accounts. When the IRS moves to seize assets, they will seize hers. There was a brief pause. I could hear the faint sound of my mother stirring her tea. Do you think she'll go to prison, Benedict? Julianne asked. There was no tremor in her voice, no maternal panic. It was a question asked with the casual curiosity of someone discussing the weather. It's federal tax fraud and multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement, Julianne, my father replied coldly. Yes, she will likely face federal time, but she will survive it. Savannah could never handle a scandal like this. She's too fragile, her public image would be destroyed, and she is carrying my grandson. Corinne is tough. She has no children. She lives a boring, invisible life, and quite frankly, she has nothing to lose. It is a necessary sacrifice to protect the Wallace name and ensure Savannah's future. You're right, my mother agreed, her voice smooth and completely devoid of a soul. It's tragic, really. But she always was the odd one out. Savannah needs this estate. Corinne will manage. I stood in the opulent bathroom, the cold marble chilling me through my shoes. This was the absolute, undeniable climax of my emotional existence. For months, a tiny, pathetic fraction of my heart had desperately clung to the hope that maybe Wyatt was the sole mastermind. Maybe he had manipulated the emails. Maybe my parents were just arrogant and willfully ignorant, but not actively malicious. Hearing their actual voices, hearing the woman who carried me for 9 months calmly agree to send me to a federal cage so my sister could keep her summer home, was the final, fatal blow. It was a profound and terrifying death. I watched the weak, desperate girl who had spent a lifetime seeking her parents' validation die right there on the imported Italian tile. She evaporated into the humid air, leaving nothing behind but the senior compliance auditor. I didn't shed a single tear. The grief was instantly incinerated by a cold, calculating, and breathtakingly clear sense of purpose. My parents had just admitted to premeditated multi-million-dollar federal framing on a crystal-clear audio recording. They had handed me the murder weapon, complete with their fingerprints, and smiled while doing it. I reached up and smoothed my hair. I checked my lipstick. I looked into my own eyes in the mirror and saw a predator staring back. I turned off the faucet, unlocked the door, and walked back down the hallway to the sunroom. As I stepped back into the light, Julianne's face instantly snapped back into a mask of maternal concern. Everything all right, darling? Perfectly fine, I smiled, returning to my seat. I looked at the manila folder sitting on the glass table. I apologize for the delay. You're right, Father. We shouldn't hold up your golf game for paperwork. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. I didn't read the documents. I didn't need to. I flipped directly to the yellow sticky tabs that Wyatt had so carefully placed. In forensic accounting and legal compliance, a signature is only binding if it can be reasonably proven to belong to the signatory, executed without duress, and officially witnessed. By using an absent notary, Wyatt had already weakened the contracts, but I was about to render them entirely, spectacularly void. My legal, government-issued name, the name tied to my social security number, my passport, and my actual bank accounts, is Corinne Elise Wallace. I have signed every legal document in my life with my full middle initial, forming a very specific, uninterrupted cursive loop between the E and the W. I placed the nib of the pen against the thick paper. I did not write Corinne Elise Wallace. I wrote Corinne A. Wallace, but I didn't stop there. I intentionally reversed the looping stroke on the capital C, and I disconnected the double N in my first name, a documented, recognized standard in forensic handwriting analysis that indicates a signature executed under severe duress or active coercion. To the naked eye of an arrogant, impatient man like my father, it looked like a messy, hurried signature. To a federal judge and a forensic document examiner, it was a glaring, undeniable red flag that screamed fraud. I flipped through the pages, signing Corinne A. Wallace with the exact same deliberate, mechanical flaws on all 14 signature lines. I was signing my own supposed death warrant, but in reality, I was pulling the pin on a legal hand grenade and rolling it directly under their feet. There, I said, capping the pen and pushing the folder back across the table. All done. I hope that helps Wyatt with the restructuring. Benedict visibly relaxed, letting out a breath he had clearly been holding. He snatched the folder up with greedy, eager hands and slid it securely back into his leather briefcase. The lock snapped shut with a definitive click. It helps immensely, Corinne. Safayamin, my father said, a genuine triumphant smirk finally breaking through his stoic facade. He thought he had won. He thought he had just successfully buried his toxic debt and his eldest daughter in one fell swoop. You've done the family a great service today. I'm always happy to help the family, Father, I replied, my voice light and pleasant. Julianne stood up, clapping her hands together. Well, I'll have the housekeeper see you out, Corinne. Your father and I really must get ready for the club. It was so lovely to see you. They were dismissing me. The transaction was complete, the scapegoat was secured, and they had absolutely no further use for my presence. "It was lovely to see you both too," I said. I retrieved my purse from the floor, my fingers briefly brushing against the underside of the table to retrieve the tiny black transmitter. I slipped it into my pocket, the recorded audio file safely secured on my encrypted server. I walked out of the sunroom, through the grand foyer, and out the heavy oak doors into the freezing Connecticut air. The wind whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt a massive surging wave of adrenaline and absolute power. I sat in my car, gripped the steering wheel, and looked back at the sprawling stone mansion. My parents were inside, celebrating their genius, completely unaware that the obedient, boring daughter they had just tried to sacrifice was currently holding the detonator to their entire world. The documents were signed, the trap was set, the investigation was over, it was time to bring the empire down. The drive back to my quiet, unassuming house felt entirely different than the drive to the Wallace estate. The crushing weight of lifelong familial expectations had completely lifted off my shoulders, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. When I walked through my front door, David was waiting in the kitchen. He took one look at my face, the eerie, absolute calm radiating from my posture, and knew exactly what had happened. I didn't say a word. I pulled my laptop from my tote bag, connected the tiny black audio transmitter, and hit play. David stood perfectly still as the voices of my parents filled our kitchen. He listened to my mother coldly calculate my ability to survive a federal penitentiary. He listened to my father proudly declare my destruction a necessary sacrifice for the family name. As the recording ended with the clink of Julianne's teacup, David's hands were trembling with a violent protective rage. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears for the wife who had just been brutally discarded by the people who were supposed to love her most. He crossed the room and pulled me into a fierce, grounding embrace. "They are dead to us," David whispered into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear to you, Corinne, we are going to tear their entire world down." "I know," I murmured against his chest, drawing strength from his unwavering loyalty, "and we are going to do it entirely by the book." The very next morning, I did not go to my office at the insurance firm. Instead, I drove to the massive, heavily secured federal building in downtown Hartford. I bypassed the local police entirely. You do not bring a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud and tax evasion case involving a prominent local real estate dynasty to a precinct chief who probably plays golf with your father. You take it to the apex predators of the financial food chain. I walked into the joint field office of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the IRS Criminal Investigation, CI, unit. I approached the bulletproof glass of the reception desk, slid my business card under the slot, and requested an immediate meeting with a supervisory special agent regarding a massive, active corporate fraud syndicate. Because of my credentials as a senior compliance auditor, they didn't make me wait. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a windowless, sterile conference room across from two veteran federal agents. Agent Miller from the FBI, a sharp-eyed man in a crisp suit, and Agent Vance from the IRS, a woman who looked like she chewed on complex tax code for breakfast. "Ms. Wallace," Agent Miller started, opening a fresh legal pad, "you stated you have evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. Who is the target?" "The target is the Wallace Family Trust, specifically operating through a fraudulent Delaware shell company named CW Holdings," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "The primary orchestrators are Wyatt Brooks, the chief financial officer, and Benedict Wallace, the CEO. Agent Vance raised an eyebrow. "Benedict Wallace, the real estate developer? Ms. Wallace, that is your father." "He is," I confirmed, not blinking, "and he is currently utilizing my stolen identity to launder millions of dollars of toxic commercial debt, evade federal taxes, and frame me for the resulting fallout." Both agents sat up noticeably straighter. I reached into my briefcase and began dealing the evidence across the metal table like a Las Vegas card dealer laying out a royal flush. First, I handed them the 50-page dossier on CW Holdings, pointing out the specific IP addresses and the corporate credit card receipt tying Wyatt directly to the formation of the LLC. Next, I handed them the massive data logs I had pulled from Wyatt's unencrypted home server using my packet sniffer. The logs contained every single email, every frantic internal memo, and the exact routing numbers he was planning to use to funnel the stolen money to the Cayman Islands. Finally, I slid a standard USB drive across the table. "On this drive is an audio recording from yesterday afternoon," I explained, looking Agent Miller dead in the eye. It contains a clear, unambiguous conversation between Benedict and Julianne Wallace. They explicitly outline their premeditated conspiracy to use me as a liability shield. Furthermore, yesterday they coerced me into signing retroactive indemnification contracts to legally bind me to the CW Holdings debt. Agent Vance frowned sharply. You signed them? Ms. Wallace, why would you put your signature on fraudulent contracts? I allowed a small, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. I didn't sign them. I executed 14 intentionally flawed signatures. I used a middle initial I never use legally, reversed my primary cursive loops, and disconnected the anchoring letters. A standard handwriting analysis will instantly flag them as signed under extreme duress. I gave them a worthless piece of paper so they would think their trap was fully operational. The silence in the interrogation room was profound. The two seasoned federal agents stared at me, realizing they were not dealing with a panicked, helpless victim. They were dealing with a fellow hunter who had just hand-delivered the career-defining bust of a lifetime, perfectly wrapped with a bow. This is an extraordinarily comprehensive package, Ms. Wallace, Agent Miller said, clearing his throat. We can secure warrants for the Wallace estate and corporate offices by the end of the week based on this alone. No, I countered smoothly, leaning back in my chair. If you raid them now, you only get them for the domestic tax fraud and the identity theft. Wyatt is currently preparing to wire approximately $8 million of remaining liquid assets to an offshore account in the Caymans to hide it from your impending IRS liens. If you want the international money laundering charges, and if you want to recover those millions for the Treasury, we wait. Agent Vance leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with sudden, intense interest. What are your terms? I am officially filing a claim under the Whistleblower Protection Act, I stated, pulling out my own prepared legal documents. I require ironclad, absolute immunity from any and all prosecution related to CW Holdings signed by a federal judge today. In exchange, I will act as a confidential informant. I will ensure that Wyatt Brooks initiates that offshore wire transfer. But I will guarantee the money lands directly in federal custody instead of the Cayman Islands. The agents exchanged a loaded look. They knew a golden goose when they saw one. Within 4 hours, the U.S. Attorney's Office had reviewed my evidence, verified the audio recording, and fast-tracked my immunity deal. A federal judge signed the order that afternoon. I walked out of the building with the absolute terrifying power of the United States government quietly backing my every move. But to execute the final phase, I needed internal access to the Wallace corporate financial system. I couldn't do it from the outside. I had to plant a Trojan horse deep inside Wyatt's fortress, and I had to make him open the gates for me himself. The following Monday, I took a personal day from my firm and drove to the sleek, glass-paneled headquarters of the Wallace Family Trust in downtown Stamford. I walked into the bustling lobby wearing a modest gray skirt suit and carrying a box of expensive pastries from a local bakery. I bypassed the receptionist with a polite wave and took the elevator directly to the executive floor. Wyatt's office was a massive corner suite with panoramic views of the city skyline. He was sitting behind a sprawling glass desk, barking orders at a terrified junior analyst over the phone. When he saw me standing in his doorway holding a pastry box, he hung up and sighed heavily. "Corinne, what are you doing here?" he asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. "This is a corporate office, not a family drop-in center. I am extremely busy." "I know, Wyatt, and I am so sorry to interrupt," I said, stepping inside and placing the box on his desk. I adopted a sheepish, apologetic posture, but I wanted to bring these as a thank you for fixing my laptop at Sunday dinner. You really saved me. Wyatt's ego instantly inflated. He eyed the pastries and leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "Like I said, it was a simple DNS bypass. You really should have your firm's IT department look into their firewall configurations. They are amateurs." I told them exactly that. I lied smoothly. I shifted my weight, looking nervously around his opulent office. "Actually, while I'm here, I wanted to offer you a favor in return. I know Q1 is closing soon, and Mother mentioned at lunch how stressed you are about the tax restructuring." Wyatt's eyes narrowed slightly. "Julianne talks too much. The restructuring is highly complex. It's not something a standard insurance auditor would understand." "I know," I agreed quickly, playing directly into his superiority complex. "I wouldn't dream of touching the high-level strategy, but I am very fast at standardizing raw data and reconciling messy vendor spreadsheets. I have some PTO saved up at my firm. If you have any basic, tedious compliance files that need organizing before you send them to your outside counsel, I could do it for free. It would save the family a fortune in billable attorney hours. I watched the gears turn in his head. Wyatt was incredibly arrogant, but he was also incredibly cheap. The idea of saving thousands of dollars in legal fees by using his boring sister-in-law for free manual labor was far too tempting for him to pass up. Furthermore, having me actively working on the company's lower-level tax files would only solidify the illusion that I was deeply involved in the corporate structure, perfect for his impending frame-up. He offered a condescending smirk. "You want to do data entry for the trust?" "Just to help out the family," I smiled warmly. Wyatt tapped his chin. "All right. I actually have a massive backlog of Q1 vendor reconciliation forms that need to be formatted for the new IRS reporting standards. It's grunt work, but it needs to be flawless. I'll have my assistant set you up in a spare cubicle down the hall." He turned to his computer and typed rapidly. "I'm issuing you a temporary restricted guest credential. It only gives you access to the lower level accounting portal and the vendor routing templates. You cannot see the primary trust accounts, the executive ledgers, or any outgoing wire authorizations. Don't try to click around where you don't belong, Corinne. The system will lock you out." "I wouldn't even know how," I assured him, accepting the printed slip of paper with my temporary login credentials. Wyatt Brooks thought he was a genius for giving me restricted bottom-tier access. He believed that the security of a financial system was built top-down, that protecting the executive dashboard was enough to secure the empire. But as a senior compliance auditor, I knew the absolute terrifying truth about corporate finance software. The executive dashboard is just a pretty interface. The actual blood of the company flows through the low-level vendor routing templates. I took my login slip, thanked him profusely, and walked down the hall to a quiet, empty cubicle. I sat down, logged into the Wallace Family Trust Enterprise Resource Planning, ERP, software, and went to work. I didn't try to hack into the executive ledgers. I didn't try to view the offshore accounts. I went straight into the dull, mundane directory of vendor payment templates, the exact place Wyatt had explicitly given me permission to be. When a company wires millions of dollars offshore, the executives don't manually type in the complex routing numbers, SWIFT codes, and international bank identifiers every single time. They use pre-saved digital templates. Wyatt had a template saved under the discrete name Global Consulting Retainer, Q1. This was the macro he used to instantly route stolen funds to his Cayman Islands shell accounts. I opened the template. The code was remarkably simple. I didn't delete the template, and I certainly didn't block it. If Wyatt tried to send the money and the system threw an error, he would instantly pivot to a backup plan. I needed him to believe the transfer was a flawless success. Instead, I executed a digital sleight of hand. I opened a backdoor portal directly to the federal escrow account that Agent Vance at the IRS had established for me that morning. I carefully deleted the Cayman Islands routing numbers embedded deep inside the template's macro script and replaced them with the direct routing numbers to the United States Treasury. The genius of this specific maneuver was in the user interface. I altered the underlying execution code, but I left the display names completely untouched. When Wyatt logged into his executive dashboard and selected Global Consulting Retainer, Q1, his screen would still explicitly show the Cayman Islands bank name and the offshore account numbers. The system would generate a beautiful, authentic-looking receipt confirming that the funds had successfully landed in the Caribbean. But the actual money, the $8 million of stolen charity, unzoned development loans, and fraudulently obtained cash, would quietly, invisibly divert straight into the waiting vault of the federal government. It took me exactly 14 minutes to rewrite the routing macro. I spent the next 3 hours organizing the vendor reconciliation forms flawlessly, just in case he checked my work. When I brought the finished files back to his office, Wyatt barely looked up from his monitors. "Done already?" he asked dismissively. "All formatted to the new federal standards," I said, placing the neatly bound folder on his desk. "I hope it helps, Wyatt." "It saves me a phone call," he muttered, waving me away. "Lock the door on your way out." I walked out of the corporate headquarters and into the bright, crisp afternoon sun. I pulled my cell phone from my purse and sent a single, encrypted text message to Agent Vance. The bridge is built, awaiting traffic. For the next 3 months, my life was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. Spring arrived, thawing the frozen Connecticut landscape, and the Wallace family operated in a state of euphoric ignorance. I attended Easter brunch at the estate. I sat at the dining table watching Savannah rub her swollen belly while Julianne practically force-fed her imported strawberries. I watched my father hold court in the living room, swirling his expensive bourbon and talking loudly about the enduring legacy of the Wallace name. I watched Wyatt check his phone every 5 minutes, sporting the arrogant, relaxed smile of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the federal government. They thought I was entirely oblivious. They thought I was sitting there, quietly drinking my coffee, completely unaware that the IRS tax lien on CW Holdings had officially expired, and the federal auditors were supposedly closing in on my personal bank accounts. They had absolutely no idea that every single time Wyatt initiated an offshore transfer over those 90 days, the money didn't go to his untouchable Caribbean fortress. He was transferring millions of dollars directly into the hands of the FBI. Agent Vance sent me weekly, heavily encrypted updates. Wyatt had moved a total of $14.2 million through the Alter template. Every single penny was currently sitting in a frozen, heavily guarded U.S. Treasury escrow account. Wyatt's actual offshore accounts were completely empty, gathering dust in the Caymans. Yet, Wyatt's executive dashboard at the office showed a flawless, artificially generated balance of $14.2 million. He was a king ruling over a completely imaginary kingdom, an emperor with absolutely no clothes. As the end of May approached, the tension within the federal task force reached its peak. We had the money. We had the audio confessions. We had the forged signatures. We had an airtight racketeering, wire fraud, and tax evasion case that would effortlessly put both Benedict and Wyatt in federal prison for decades. Agent Miller called me on a secure line on a Tuesday evening. "Corinne," the FBI agent said, his voice thrumming with suppressed adrenaline, "the U.S. attorney has signed the final warrants. We have tactical teams standing by in Stamford and at the local precinct. We are ready to execute the raid on the Wallace estate and the corporate headquarters simultaneously tomorrow morning." I stood in my kitchen, looking out the window at the blooming hydrangea bushes in my modest backyard. A quiet morning raid. Flashbangs at dawn, men in windbreakers dragging my father out in his pajamas, whisking them away in unmarked SUVs before the neighbors even had time to pour their coffee. It was efficient, it was standard protocol, and it was entirely unacceptable. My family had not committed their crimes in the shadows. They had flaunted their stolen wealth under the bright, glittering chandeliers of high society. They had used their social status as a weapon to make me feel small, insignificant, and expendable. They had treated me like a peasant at their anniversary gala, and they had planned my destruction while sipping fine tea in a sunlit room. I didn't want them arrested quietly. I wanted their empire to burn down in front of the exact people they had spent 40 years trying to impress. "Agent Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, commanding register, "we are not doing a morning raid." "Ms. Wallace, standard procedure dictates this Friday night," I interrupted. "The Wallace Family Trust is hosting its annual summer solstice charity gala at the estate. It is the social event of the season. Every major real estate developer, private equity investor, and local politician in Connecticut will be standing in my parents' ballroom. My father and Wyatt are scheduled to give a joint keynote speech at 9 o'clock regarding the financial health of the trust." I paused, letting the sheer theatrical magnitude of the opportunity sink into the federal agent's mind. "You don't want to arrest them in their pajamas, Agent Miller," I continued, a dark smile spreading across my face. "You want to arrest them in their tuxedos. You want the entire financial sector of New England to watch you put the handcuffs on Benedict Wallace. It sends a message." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could practically hear Agent Miller and Agent Vance looking at each other across their desk in Hartford. Federal agencies loved high-profile takedowns just as much as my mother loved a photo opportunity. "Friday night," Agent Miller finally agreed, a distinct note of anticipation in his tone. "We will have 50 agents mobilized at the perimeter of the estate by 8:30. You will be inside. Give us the signal, and we will bring the house down." "Perfect," I whispered. I hung up the phone and turned to David, who had been listening quietly from the doorway. He walked over, took my hands in his, and looked at me with a fierce, absolute pride. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly. "I have been ready for 42 years, I replied. The spider had finished spinning the web. The trap was flawlessly integrated into the very foundation of their lives. All that was left to do was wait for the gala, watch them step onto the grand stage, and turn the lights out on the Wallace dynasty forever. The Summer Solstice Charity Gala was the crown jewel of the Wallace family's social calendar. Held on the longest day of the year, it was designed to project an image of endless, radiant prosperity. By 8 o'clock that Friday evening, the sprawling back lawns of the Connecticut estate had been transformed into a breathtaking wonderland of white silk tents, cascading floral arrangements of orchids and peonies, and thousands of twinkling fairy lights strung through the ancient oak trees. A string quartet played softly in the background, entirely drowned out by the overlapping chatter of 300 of New England's wealthiest elites. Politicians, real estate moguls, and private equity executives milled about the manicured grass, holding flutes of vintage champagne. David and I arrived quietly, slipping through the grand foyer and out onto the terrace. I was wearing a sleek, tailored black evening gown, unassuming, unflashy, and perfectly suited for a funeral. David wore a classic dark suit, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back as we surveyed the crowd. "Look at them," David murmured, his eyes scanning the sea of tuxedos and designer dresses. "They have absolutely no idea they are drinking on the deck of the Titanic. And the iceberg is currently parked 3 blocks away in unmarked black SUVs," I whispered back. We navigated the crowd, making our way toward the center of the main tent where my family was holding court. My mother, Julianne, was draped in a silver sequined gown, looking like a glittering ice queen as she accepted compliments from the wife of a local state senator. Beside her, Savannah was the picture of glowing maternity, wearing a custom blush pink dress that perfectly accentuated her 6-month baby bump. As we approached, Julianne's eyes darted over my plain black dress, her mouth tightening into a brief, critical line before the fake, camera-ready smile returned. "Corinne, David, you made it," Julianne said, her tone implying it was a minor miracle we had managed to find the address. "I was beginning to think you were going to skip the gala again to do your, paperwork." "I wouldn't miss tonight for the world, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level. Wyatt stepped into the circle, handing Savannah a crystal glass of sparkling water. He was wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, his hair perfectly slicked back. He looked incredibly smug, radiating the toxic, buoyant energy of a man who believed he had just pulled off the crime of the century. And why wouldn't he? According to his executive dashboard, $14 million of stolen funds were sitting safely in his offshore accounts, out of the reach of the IRS, while the liability was strapped firmly to my back. "Corinne," Wyatt said, raising his glass in a mocking toast, "glad you could take a break from the cubicle. Have you checked your mail lately? Any interesting letters from the government?" It was a cruel, arrogant taunt. He was poking the bear, entirely confident that I was too stupid to understand he had sent the IRS to my door. He wanted to see me sweat. He wanted to watch me panic in the middle of his perfect party. I met his gaze, my expression completely blank. "Just the usual bills, Wyatt. Why do you ask?" He smirked, taking a sip of his scotch. "No reason, just, it's tax season. Things can get complicated for people who don't know how to manage their finances." "Wyatt is right," my father, Benedict, boomed as he joined our circle. He adjusted his silk bow tie, projecting the aura of a benevolent king surveying his loyal subjects. "Financial literacy is crucial. It's why the Wallace Family Trust remains a pillar of this community. We understand risk and we know how to mitigate it." He looked at me, a dark, knowing glint in his eye. "We protect the legacy at all costs." "Indeed you do, Father," I said softly. My cell phone vibrated twice against my thigh, tucked into the hidden pocket of my gown. It was the signal from Agent Miller. The perimeter was secured. 50 federal agents were in position, waiting for my green light. "If you'll excuse me," Wyatt said, checking his heavy gold Rolex. "I need to make a quick phone call before Benedict and I give the keynote address. Business never sleeps." He offered Savannah a kiss on the cheek and walked away, disappearing into the opulent, dimly lit corridors of the main house. I knew exactly who he was calling. I had anticipated this move. Wyatt was a sociopath, but he was a predictable one. He couldn't just let the IRS slowly audit me. He wanted the explosive, immediate satisfaction of a public arrest. He was retreating to his private study to use a burner phone to call the FBI's regional tip line. He was going to anonymously report that Corinne Wallace, the sole proprietor of the fraudulent CW Holdings, was currently attempting to flee the state and was located at the Wallace estate. He wanted the police to drag me out of the gala in handcuffs, cementing his role as the shocked, innocent family member in front of 300 witnesses. He thought he was pulling the strings. He didn't know the marionette had already cut the wires and handed them to the federal government. I waited exactly 4 minutes, allowing Wyatt enough time to complete his anonymous tip. Then I reached into my pocket, unlocked my phone entirely blind, and pressed the single, pre-programmed speed dial button. The call connected. "Execute," I whispered under my breath. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned to David. I didn't need to say a word. He squared his shoulders, stepping slightly closer to me, his eyes locked on the grand entrance of the main tent. The string quartet was just finishing a lively Vivaldi piece when the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly, violently shifted. It didn't begin with a shout, but with a ripple of profound collective confusion. The waiters stationed near the terrace doors froze, their silver trays hovering in the air. The hushed, wealthy chatter died out in a rapid wave, sweeping from the back of the tent all the way to the front stage, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. I turned around just as the massive double doors of the estate were thrown open. They did not look like local police officers arriving to quietly escort a tax evader off the premises. They were a swarm of federal tactical agents moving with terrifying military-grade precision. They wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright, unmistakable yellow letters of the FBI and IRSCI emblazoned across their backs. Heavy combat boots thudded against the pristine white marble of the terrace. Their faces were grim, completely unmoved by the staggering wealth surrounding them. The crowd of millionaires and politicians parted like the Red Sea, scrambling backward, knocking over cocktail tables and shattering crystal glasses on the stone patio. Women gasped, clutching their pearl necklaces, while the men stared in absolute paralyzed shock. Agent Miller and Agent Vance led the formation, walking with a synchronized, lethal purpose straight down the center aisle of the tent, heading directly for the Wallace family. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Savannah gripped the edge of a table, her face draining of all color as she stared at the federal agents swarming her perfect party. Benedict stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red. The patriarch of the Wallace family was not used to his authority being challenged, especially not in his own home. "What is the meaning of this?" Benedict bellowed, his voice echoing off the canvas ceiling. "Who is in charge here? This is private property. You are trespassing on a closed charity event." Before the agents could respond, Wyatt emerged from the house, practically jogging back to the tent. He looked at the swarm of FBI windbreakers, and a look of absolute triumphant glee flashed across his face. He thought his anonymous phone call had worked perfectly. He thought they were here for me. Wyatt immediately slipped into his pre-planned role. He rushed to Benedict's side, holding his hands up in a gesture of fake, panicked surrender, playing the concerned family man. "Officers, please, calm down," Wyatt shouted, projecting his voice so the entire crowd of investors and politicians could hear him clearly. "There's no need to cause a scene. I don't know what this is about, but if you're looking for the CEO of CW Holdings, if you're looking for the person responsible for the tax fraud, she is right there." Wyatt pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at my chest. The entire room turned to look at me. 300 pairs of eyes bored into my skin, heavy with sudden judgment and disgust. My mother let out a theatrical sob, turning away as if she couldn't bear to look at her criminal daughter. Savannah stared at me with wide, betrayed eyes, perfectly executing the script they had all agreed upon. "Corinne," Benedict said, his voice dripping with manufactured heartbreak, "what have you done to this family?" I stood perfectly still in my black gown. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for my parents to believe me. I looked at Wyatt, whose arm was still extended, pointing at me like a loaded gun. "Actually, Wyatt," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. It was not the voice of a timid, boring auditor. It was cold, amplified, and carried the terrifying weight of absolute certainty. "I think they're looking for the man who used the name of his golden retriever to lock his offshore bank accounts." Wyatt's outstretched arm froze. The triumphant smirk instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. He stared at me, his eyes wide and frantic, his brain desperately trying to process how I could possibly know the master password to his Cayman Islands shell companies. Before he could even open his mouth to speak, Agent Miller bypassed me entirely. He didn't even look in my direction. He walked straight up to the chief financial officer of the Wallace Trust, grabbed Wyatt by his bespoke tuxedo lapels, and slammed him face first onto the linen-draped cocktail table. "Wyatt Brooks!" Agent Miller barked, the sound of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoing like gunshots across the silent tent. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and identity theft." "Wait! No! Get your hands off me!" Wyatt shrieked, struggling wildly against the FBI agent's crushing grip. His perfectly slicked hair fell into his face, his arrogant composure completely shattered. "You have the wrong person. It's her. Look at the Delaware filings. Her name is on the company." "We've seen the filings, Mr. Brooks," Agent Vance said coldly, stepping up beside him. "And we've also seen the corporate credit card receipt you used to pay the registration fees. You're not nearly as smart as you think you are." At the exact same moment, 2 massive IRS tactical agents flanked my father. Benedict backed away, his hands trembling violently, his eyes darting toward the exit, but there was nowhere to run. The agents grabbed his arms, wrenching them forcefully behind his back. "Benedict Wallace," the second FBI agent announced loudly, ensuring every single wealthy donor and politician in the room heard the charges clearly. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal tax evasion, racketeering, and corporate fraud." "This is an outrage," Benedict roared, his voice cracking as the handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists. The imposing, untouchable patriarch was reduced to a struggling, red-faced criminal in front of his entire empire. "I am Benedict Wallace. I own half this city. I demand to speak to my attorneys. This is a setup. My daughter forged those documents." My father looked at me, his eyes burning with a desperate, vicious hatred. "Tell them, Corinne. Tell them you signed those liability waivers. You signed the contracts." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd watched in absolute silence, captivated by the spectacular destruction of the Wallace dynasty playing out before their eyes. "You mean the retroactive indemnification contracts you coerced me into signing in the sunroom 5 months ago?" I asked, my voice carrying a lethal, echoing calm. I reached into David's suit jacket and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it and held it up. It was a blown-up, high-resolution copy of the signature page they had forced me to sign. "I didn't sign those contracts, Father," I explained, looking down at him as he was held by the federal agents. "I executed 14 instances of documented forensic forgery. I used a middle initial that does not exist on any of my legal government identification. I intentionally reversed the cursive anchoring loops. By the legal standards of the state of Connecticut, and according to the federal judge who reviewed them yesterday, those contracts are entirely null, void, and practically scream active coercion." My father's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The realization that his timid daughter had actively sabotaged his legal firewall right in front of his face hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, the agents having to support his weight to keep him from collapsing onto the marble patio. Wyatt, however, was still fighting. He twisted his head to glare at me, spit flying from his lips as he clung desperately to the last shred of his arrogant delusion. "You stupid bitch!" Wyatt screamed, abandoning all pretense of being a civilized executive. "You think a fake signature matters? The money is already gone. I transferred $14 million out of the country. The Wallace Trust is safe, and I will tie you up in court for the next 30 years while I live off the interest in the Caymans. You can't touch it." I didn't yell back. I just looked at him with a profound, chilling pity. "You didn't transfer a single penny to the Cayman Islands, Wyatt," I said softly, but the microphone on the nearby stage caught my voice, broadcasting my words across the entire stunned ballroom. Wyatt stopped struggling. He froze, staring at me with a sudden, suffocating terror dawning in his eyes. "Do you remember when I came to your office in March to format your vendor reconciliation forms?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You were so proud of yourself for giving me restricted bottom-tier access. You thought the executive dashboard was the only thing that mattered, but you forgot that the actual money flows through the low-level routing templates." I took another step closer, lowering my voice so he could hear the exact mechanical details of his total destruction. "I rewrote your global consulting retainer macro, Wyatt. I deleted your offshore SWIFT codes. For the last 3 months, every time you hit execute on a wire transfer, the money didn't go to the Caribbean. It went directly into an escrow account managed by the United States Treasury." I let the reality of the words hang in the air. "Your offshore accounts are completely empty," I concluded, the final nail in his coffin. "The $14 million you stole from the investors standing in this room has been seized by the federal government. You are completely bankrupt, and your executive dashboard has been lying to you for 90 days. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy donors as they realized that the man they had trusted with their investments had been actively robbing them blind. Wyatt let out a guttural, animalistic sound of pure despair. His legs completely gave out. The arrogant, slick CFO collapsed, hanging entirely by his handcuffed wrists in the grip of the federal agents. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he sobbed uncontrollably into the white linen tablecloth. He had tried to play a game of financial chess against a grandmaster, and he hadn't even realized the board was rigged from the very first move. "Take them out," Agent Miller ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The federal agents hauled Wyatt and Benedict to their feet, dragging them roughly away from the center of the gala. The local news crews, who had been tipped off by the FBI just 10 minutes prior, were waiting at the edge of the terrace. The blinding white flashes of cameras erupted in a continuous strobing assault, capturing the spectacular, humiliating downfall of the Wallace Empire in high definition. My father didn't look back at me. His head was bowed, his legacy entirely reduced to ashes. Wyatt was weeping openly, stumbling over his expensive leather shoes as he was paraded past the disgusted glares of his former friends and colleagues. As the men were dragged away, the silence in the tent returned, broken only by the sound of frantic, hysterical weeping. My mother, Julianne, had collapsed onto a velvet chaise lounge. Her silver sequined dress was bunched around her knees, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-streaked face. The Ice Queen had completely melted into a puddle of terrified, pathetic reality. Savannah was standing a few feet away, her hands protectively clutching her pregnant belly. She looked from the flashing cameras back to me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. The lavish, consequence-free life she had built her entire identity around had just evaporated into thin air. "Corinne!" Julianne gasped, crawling forward slightly, reaching a trembling hand out toward the hem of my black dress. "Corinne, please, you have to tell them it's a mistake. They're taking your father. They're going to seize the house. Savannah has nowhere to go. She's pregnant. Please, you have the power to stop this. You have to fix it." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I remembered the cold, pragmatic tone in her voice on the audio recording, calmly agreeing that my life in a federal prison was a necessary sacrifice so her golden child could keep her summer home. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. I stepped back, ensuring her trembling fingers couldn't touch my dress. "I did exactly what you raised me to do, Mother," I said, my voice empty of any affection. "I did the math. I managed the liabilities, and I shielded the innocent." I looked at Savannah, who was sobbing into her hands. "Wyatt's assets are frozen. The IRS will be seizing this estate, the cars, and the trust accounts by Monday morning to pay back the toxic debt. You should start packing tonight." Julianne let out an agonizing theatrical wail, burying her face in the cushions as the remaining federal agents began taping off the entrances to the main house, securing the premises for the impending asset seizure. The wealthy guests were already sprinting for the valet, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wallace family. The empire was dead. The curtain had fallen. I turned my back on the weeping women who used to be my family. David took my hand, his grip warm, solid, and fiercely protective. We walked off the marble terrace, down the sweeping driveway, and out into the cool, dark summer night, leaving the burning wreckage of the Wallace dynasty entirely behind us. The morning after the summer solstice gala, the state of Connecticut woke up to a seismic shift in its social and financial bedrock. The spectacular downfall of the Wallace family wasn't just local news. It was the lead story on every major national financial network. The footage captured by the local media crews, Wyatt Brooks sobbing into a linen tablecloth in his bespoke tuxedo, and Benedict Wallace, the untouchable titan of real estate, being shoved into the back of a federal SUV, played on an endless, looping highlight reel. David and I sat at our kitchen island, drinking our morning coffee in the quiet, sunlit peace of our home. We watched the television screen as reporters stood outside the padlocked iron gates of the Wallace estate. The U.S. Marshals had already moved in, plastering bright orange seizure notices across the heavy oak doors of the mansion. I watched the empire I had grown up in burn to the ground, and for the first time in 42 years, I felt a profound, absolute lightness in my chest. There was no guilt. There was no lingering sense of familial obligation. You cannot mourn a family that never truly existed. You can only celebrate surviving them. The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. By Monday morning, Wyatt and my father were standing in a federal courtroom in Hartford for their arraignment. David and I sat in the very back row of the gallery, completely unnoticed by the swarm of reporters pressing against the wooden benches. They were brought in wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles chained. The transformation was staggering. In just 48 hours, the blinding arrogance had been stripped away. Wyatt looked physically ill, his skin a sallow, terrified gray. He kept looking around the courtroom, his eyes darting frantically, hoping to see a team of high-priced corporate defense attorneys waiting to bail him out. But there were no high-priced attorneys. When the federal judge read the charges, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international money laundering, identity theft, and tax evasion under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, Act, Wyatt's assigned public defender had to physically hold him up by the elbow to keep him from collapsing. Because Wyatt had utilized international wire templates and attempted to move $14 million offshore, the U.S. Attorney's Office successfully argued that both he and Benedict were extreme flight risks. Furthermore, because the IRS had enacted a total immediate freeze on every single bank account associated with the Wallace Trust, CW, holdings and their personal assets, they literally did not possess the capital to post bail. The judge struck his gavel. Bail was denied. The titan of Connecticut real estate and his brilliant chief financial officer were remanded back to the federal detention center, forced to sit in tiny concrete cells to await a trial they had absolutely no hope of winning. But the physical arrests were only the beginning of the destruction. The true, agonizing climax of my family's ruin happened 3 weeks later in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of a neutral mediation attorney in downtown Stamford. I was summoned there by a frantic, certified letter from my mother. The Wallace estate was in the final stages of federal foreclosure, and Julianne was desperate to salvage the remaining scraps of her shattered reality. I walked into the conference room wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit. David was by my side, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Sitting across the long mahogany table were Julianne and Savannah. The visual contrast was jarring. My mother, the woman who had spent decades curating an image of flawless, icy perfection, looked aged by 10 years. She was wearing a plain black dress, her jewelry conspicuously absent, likely seized or pawned to pay for groceries. Savannah sat beside her, her heavily pregnant belly resting against the edge of the table. Her eyes were red and swollen, the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks etched deeply into her previously flawless features. They didn't have Wyatt or Benedict to hide behind anymore. They had to face me alone. Julianne cleared her throat, attempting to summon the ghosts of her former authority. She straightened her spine, looking at me with a mixture of bitter resentment and desperate entitlement. "Corinne," my mother began, her voice tight and trembling, "I assume you are satisfied. You have completely destroyed your father. You have ruined your sister's marriage. The federal government is auctioning off our home next Tuesday." The federal government is auctioning off a home bought and maintained with stolen charity funds and fraudulent commercial loans. Mother, I corrected smoothly, pulling a chair out and sitting down directly across from her. I simply provided the map. You and father dug the grave. Savannah let out a ragged sob, burying her face in her hands. "Why did you do this, Corinne? You have a good job. You and David have a house. Why did you have to take everything from us? Wyatt is facing 30 years. My baby is going to be born while his father is in a federal penitentiary." I looked at my younger sister, feeling the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt ledger. "Wyatt is facing 30 years because he stole $14 million and tried to frame me for it, Savannah," I stated, refusing to let her twist the narrative into victimhood. "Do you honestly expect me to apologize for not going to federal prison in his place? For not letting the IRS seize my home so you could buy a summer house in the Hamptons? Your husband is a criminal. You enjoyed the spoils of his crimes for years without ever questioning where the money came from. This is the bill coming due." Julianne slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table, the sudden, sharp noise echoing in the quiet room. Her eyes flared with that familiar, toxic arrogance. Even now, with her empire reduced to ashes, she could not fathom the idea of actually losing to the daughter she considered entirely inferior. "Enough!" Julianne snapped, her voice dropping into a vicious, desperate hiss. "You made your point, Corinne. You proved you are smarter than Wyatt, but you are not going to leave us on the street. I refuse to be humiliated by you any further." She reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of documents, sliding them across the table toward me. "The federal government seized the primary Wallace Trust and the corporate holdings," Julianne said, a dark, triumphant smirk briefly touching her lips. "But they did not seize everything. They cannot touch my personal generational trust, nor can they touch the deed to the private beachfront property in Nantucket that my grandfather left me. It is entirely isolated from Benedict's business. It is clean money." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the documents. I am liquidating the Nantucket property. It will easily fetch $4 million. Savannah and I are moving there to rebuild, but the title company requires the signature of all living legal heirs to expedite the emergency sale. You are going to sign a release of your claim to that property right now, Corinne. You owe us that much for tearing this family apart. I looked down at the documents she had aggressively pushed across the table. It was the final pathetic thrashing of a woman who truly believed she could still command the universe to bend to her will. She thought she had found a loophole. She thought she was going to escape the absolute ruin she had designed for me, retreating to a luxury beachfront home to live out her days in quiet comfort while her husband rotted in a cell. I didn't reach for the pen. I just leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and looked at her. You really didn't understand a single thing that happened at the gala, did you, Mother? I asked softly, a terrifying chill creeping into the room. Julianne frowned, her false confidence faltering slightly under my steady, unblinking gaze. What are you talking about? Sign the papers, Corinne. Mother, do you remember the 3 months I spent helping Wyatt at the corporate office? I asked, completely ignoring her demand. Do you remember how eager you and Father were to have me handle the mundane paperwork? You kept handing me stacks of trust updates, vendor logs, and asset transfer files to organize and sign. You thought you were burying me in administrative busywork while you built your firewall. I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out a single, heavily embossed legal folder. I placed it gently on top of her desperate title release forms. As a senior compliance auditor, my specialty isn't just finding hidden money, I explained, my voice echoing with absolute, undeniable finality. My specialty is the meticulous, flawless execution of legal contracts. I flipped the folder open. While you and Father were busy planning my destruction, I was busy slipping my own paperwork into those massive stacks of administrative files, I continued, tracing the lines of the top document with my finger. You were so arrogant, so entirely convinced of your own superiority that neither you, nor Father, nor your brilliant chief financial officer ever bothered to read the fine print of the documents I was sliding across your desks. Julianne's breath caught in her throat. The color completely drained from her face as she stared at the heavy legal paper. Savannah stopped crying, her eyes widening in horror as she slowly began to understand the magnitude of what I was saying. The documents you signed during those 3 months weren't just trust updates, Mother, I said, leaning forward to deliver the absolute fatal blow to her reality. They were irrevocable deeds of gift and comprehensive, durable power of attorney transfers. No, Julianne whispered, her voice a fragile, broken rasp. She grabbed the folder, her hands shaking violently as her eyes frantically scanned the dense legal jargon. Yes, I confirmed. You and Father willingly, legally, and permanently signed away the absolute totality of your remaining clean assets. Every single personal trust, every hidden savings account, and yes, the deed to the beachfront property in Nantucket. Because you signed them without duress, with your authentic, verified signatures, the transfers were flawless. I watched the exact moment her soul shattered. But I didn't keep a single penny for myself, I added, driving the final nail into the coffin. That would be unethical. As soon as the transfers cleared, I exercised my power of attorney to immediately donate the entire portfolio. The Nantucket house, the generational trust, every last clean dollar you possessed, to a national charity that provides emergency housing and legal aid for survivors of domestic and financial abuse. The silence in the conference room was absolute, suffocating, and terrifying. It's gone, Mother, I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. The charity liquidated the Nantucket property 3 weeks ago. The money has already been distributed to build women's shelters across the state. You have absolutely nothing left. You are completely, entirely, and permanently bankrupt. Julianne let out a sound that didn't even sound human. It was a guttural, agonizing shriek of pure, unadulterated devastation. Her entire identity, her superiority, her safety net, everything she had ever valued more than her own daughter, had just been evaporated by the stroke of her own pen. She slumped forward in her chair, burying her face in her arms, weeping with a chaotic, broken hysteria that echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. Savannah sat completely frozen in her chair, staring at the wall behind me. The golden child, the sister who had happily watched her parents plot my ruin so she could maintain her lavish lifestyle, was finally facing the cold, terrifying reality of the real world. She had a baby on the way, a husband facing decades in federal prison, and not a single dime to her name. She had been stripped of her royal status and thrown to the wolves she had helped feed. I stood up, buttoning my navy suit jacket. I looked down at the two women weeping at the table, feeling a profound, sweeping sense of closure. The scales of justice had not just been balanced. They had been entirely dismantled and rebuilt in my image. "We are done here," I said quietly. David picked up my briefcase, offering me a small, fiercely proud smile. He took my hand and we walked out of the conference room, leaving Julianne and Savannah behind in the ashes of the empire they had tried to bury me beneath. Exactly 1 year later, the humid, sweet air of the New England summer drifted through the open, floor-to-ceiling windows of our new home. David and I were standing on the expansive rooftop terrace of a stunning, modern penthouse overlooking the Long Island Sound. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold, casting a warm, peaceful glow over the water. The justice system had operated with a rare, absolute efficiency. Benedict Wallace and Wyatt Brooks had both been found guilty on all 27 counts of federal fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The judge, entirely unmoved by their former social status, threw the book at them. My father was sentenced to 20 years in a medium security federal penitentiary. Wyatt, the arrogant architect of the scheme, received 35 years without the possibility of early parole. They were completely erased from the Connecticut high society circles they had once ruled, remembered only as a cautionary tale of spectacular greed. Savannah's reality had crashed down upon her with brutal force. Without the Wallace Trust to support her, she had been evicted from her pristine mansion. The last I heard through the grapevine, she was living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a run-down industrial suburb, working the customer service desk at a local retail chain to make ends meet while raising her newborn son entirely alone. The endless stream of designer clothes and luxury vacations had been replaced by the exhausting, terrifying struggle of paycheck-to-paycheck survival. My mother, Julianne, had suffered the most agonizing fate a woman of her vanity could endure: absolute social irrelevance. Stripped of her wealth and entirely shunned by the wealthy elites she had spent her life trying to impress, she was a complete pariah. She was living in a small, subsidized senior housing unit on the outskirts of the city, utterly alone, spending her days obsessing over the memories of an empire that she had destroyed with her own arrogance. As for me, the universe has a beautiful way of rewarding those who play the long game. Because I had formally filed under the Whistleblower Protection Act, and because my meticulous forensic investigation had allowed the federal government to successfully seize and recover the entire $14 million Wyatt had attempted to steal, I was legally entitled to a whistleblower reward. The IRS pays confidential informants between 15% and 30% of the total recovered assets. 6 months after the trial concluded, the United States Treasury wired an untaxed, completely clean reward of $3.5 million directly into my secure personal account. My family had plotted to send me to a federal prison, convinced that my quiet, invisible life was entirely worthless. Instead, they had inadvertently funded my complete financial independence. I left the corporate insurance firm, opening my own boutique forensic accounting consultancy. I now spend my days taking on cases for vulnerable individuals and small businesses who have been targeted by wealthy, arrogant financial predators. I use the exact skills my family mocked to protect people who cannot protect themselves. I leaned against the glass railing of the terrace, sipping a glass of iced tea, watching a sailboat drift lazily across the horizon. David wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "It's peaceful up here," he murmured, kissing the side of my neck. "It really is," I agreed, leaning back into his solid, unwavering embrace. The heavy, toxic burden I had carried for 42 years was completely gone. The ghosts of the Wallace estate no longer haunted my mind. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my life. Family is never defined by a shared last name or a bloodline. It is defined by the people who stand fiercely by your side when the wolves are at the door. My parents had tried to bury me in the dark, thinking I was nothing but a fragile paper pusher who would quietly accept her fate. They had no idea they were bearing a seed. And from the ashes of their lies, their deceit, and their spectacular ruin, I had bloomed into an absolute force of nature. The best revenge isn't screaming, it isn't violence. The absolute best, most devastating revenge is living a massive, unbothered, and undeniably brilliant life built entirely on the ruins of the people who tried to destroy you. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you made it all the way to the end of this journey with me, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and there are always more stories of survival and justice waiting to be told. Until next time, stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone tell you your worth.